The envelope was sitting in my mailbox when I got home from work on a Wednesday evening. It was addressed to Margaret Ann Foster, my mother's name, at my address. The return label said Providence Regional Medical Center, Billing Department. I stood there holding it, my groceries in the other hand, staring at her name printed in neat black letters. My mother died 28 years ago. I was 11 when we buried her in Cedar Grove Cemetery, next to her parents. I'd visited her grave twice in the last decade. The stone was simple, clean, marked with her name and dates 1952-1996. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a billing statement dated 2 weeks ago. Services rendered: emergency room visit, blood panel X-ray, CT scan. Total charges $4,300. Date of service March 16th. 3 weeks ago. I set the groceries down on the counter and read the bill again. There was a patient account number, an admission time 11:47 p.m., and a discharge time 3:22 a.m. The physician's name was Dr. Amelia Voss. The address listed for Margaret Foster was mine. I sat down at the kitchen table and tried to make sense of it. Identity theft, obviously. Someone had stolen my mother's information and used it. But why use my address? And how had they even gotten her details? I called the hospital's billing department the next morning. A woman named Carol answered. I explained the situation. That Margaret Foster had been deceased for 28 years and that I'd received a bill in her name. Carol asked for the account number. I gave it to her. She put me on hold. When she came back, her tone had changed. She said, I'm showing the patient was admitted through the ER on March 16th. The intake form lists you as the emergency contact. I said, I didn't admit anyone. She said, the signature on file matches the contact name. It says Margaret Foster was brought in by family. I said, who brought her in? She said, I don't have that information, but the billing address is yours. Are you listed as next of kin? I said, I'm her daughter. But she's been dead since 1996. Carol paused. I'm going to transfer you to our patient services coordinator. This needs to be investigated. I was transferred twice more before I reached someone named Brian in the fraud prevention department. I explained everything again. He said they'd flag the account and launch an internal review. He said it could take 2 to 3 weeks. I asked if I could get copies of the intake paperwork and medical records. He said, only if you're the authorized representative. Do you have power of attorney? I said, she's dead. I can provide a death certificate. He said, send that over. We'll go from there. I hung up and sat in my office, staring at the wall. I was 40 years old, a compliance officer for a nonprofit. I lived alone in a house I'd owned for 6 years. I'd never been married, no children. My life was orderly, predictable, the way I liked it. My mother's death had been sudden, an aneurysm. She'd collapsed in the kitchen one morning while I was getting ready for school. My father had called 911, but she'd died before the ambulance arrived. I remembered the funeral, my father standing rigid and silent beside the casket. I remembered my older brother, Eric, crying in a way I'd never seen before. I remembered not crying at all. My father had remarried 2 years later. A woman named Deanne, efficient and cold. She'd moved into our house, rearranged everything, and acted like my mother had never existed. Eric had left for college the following year. I'd stayed until I turned 18, then left and didn't look back. My father died in 2015. Heart attack. I went to the funeral but didn't speak to Diane. Eric and I exchanged brief condolences but didn't stay in touch. We lived in different states, different lives. I pulled my mother's death certificate from my filing cabinet. I'd gotten a copy years ago when settling some old insurance paperwork. I scanned it and emailed it to the hospital. Brian called me back 3 days later. He said, we've reviewed the intake records. The patient presented with symptoms of acute chest pain and shortness of breath. She gave her name as Margaret Foster and listed your address. The signature on the intake form doesn't match anything we have on file for comparison, but the information provided was consistent. I said, did anyone verify her identity? He said, ER protocol requires a photo ID or insurance card. The notes indicate she didn't have either. She said she'd lost her wallet. Given her symptoms, the focus was on stabilization, not verification. I said, so someone walked into your ER? Gave a dead woman's name, and you just treated them? He said, "We treated someone in distress. We're now trying to determine who that person was." I said, "Can I see the security footage?" He said, "That's a law enforcement matter. If you believe a crime occurred, you'll need to file a police report." I filed a police report that afternoon. The officer who took my statement was named Detective Lisa Park. She was in her 40s, calm, methodical. I showed her the bill, the death certificate, and the timeline. She said, "This could be identity theft, fraud, or something else. I'll request the hospital's records and footage. It'll take time." I said, "How much time?" She said, "Weeks, maybe longer. Hospitals move slowly." I thanked her and left. Over the next few days I kept thinking about it. Something felt wrong beyond the obvious fraud. Why use my mother's name? Why give my address? It felt personal. I started going through old family documents. I found boxes I hadn't opened in years: photos, tax records, medical files. In one box, I found a folder with my mother's medical history from the early 90s. I flipped through it. Routine checkups, a few prescriptions. Nothing unusual. Then I found something strange. A hospital bill from 1994, 2 years before she died. It was from a different hospital. St. Mary's, in a town 30 miles away. The charges were for a psychiatric evaluation and a 3-day inpatient stay. The diagnosis code was listed as acute stress reaction. I'd never heard anything about this. My mother had never mentioned being hospitalized for psychiatric care. Neither had my father. I called St. Mary's and requested records. They said they'd need authorization. I sent the death certificate and explained I was her daughter. They said they'd review and get back to me. Detective Park called me 2 weeks after I filed the report. She said, "I got the security footage from the hospital. You need to see this." I met her at the police station. She led me to a small room with a monitor. She pulled up the footage and pressed play. The timestamp read March 16, 11:43 p.m. The camera showed the ER entrance. A woman walked in, mid-60s, thin, wearing a coat and scarf. Her face was partially obscured, but she moved slowly, like someone in pain. Detective Park froze the frame and zoomed in. The woman's face was visible for just a moment. Gaunt, weathered, but unmistakable. I said, "That's my mother." Detective Park looked at me. "Your mother's been dead for 28 years. I said, "I know. But that's her." She said, "Are you sure?" I said, "I'm sure." She rewound the footage and played it again. I watched the way the woman moved, the tilt of her head, the shape of her hands. It was her. Older, worn, but her. Detective Park said, "If that's your mother, then who did you bury in 1996? I didn't have an answer. She said, "I'm going to need to escalate this. We might need to exhume the body." I said, "Do it." The exhumation required a court order. Detective Park filed the request, citing evidence of possible fraud and mistaken identity. The judge approved it within a week. The exhumation took place on a gray morning in April. I stood at a distance and watched the crew work. When they opened the casket, Detective Park called me over. She said, "The remains are consistent with a female, approximate age 40 to 50, but will need forensic analysis to confirm identity." The remains were sent for DNA testing. Detective Park said it would take 4 to 6 weeks. During the wait, St. Mary's Hospital called me back. They said they'd located my mother's records from 1994. They'd send copies within a week. The records arrived in a thick envelope. I read through them carefully. My mother had been admitted for severe anxiety and depression. The notes indicated she'd had a breakdown after a family crisis. She'd been treated with medication and therapy and discharged after 3 days with a referral for outpatient care. There was a section labeled Family History. It noted that the patient had experienced significant trauma related to undisclosed family circumstances, and that her husband had been resistant to her receiving treatment. I called Detective Park and told her what I'd found. She said, "I'm starting to think your father knew more than he let on." I said, "He's dead." She said, "What about his second wife, Diane?" I said, "We haven't spoken in years." She said, "You might need to." I tracked down Diane through public records. She was still living in the same house my father had owned, now in her 70s. I called her. She sounded surprised to hear from me. I said, "I need to ask you about my mother." She said, "Your mother died before I even met your father." I said, Did he ever talk about her? She hesitated. Not much. He didn't like to. I said, did he ever mention anything strange about her death? She said, what do you mean? I said, I'm asking if you ever had any reason to believe she didn't die. There was a long silence. Then she said, you should come here. I drove to the house the next day. Diane met me at the door. She looked older, smaller than I remembered. She led me to the living room and offered tea. I declined. She sat down and folded her hands. She said, your father told me something once, years ago. We'd been drinking. He said he'd made a terrible mistake. He said he'd done something he couldn't undo, and it haunted him. I said, what did he do? She said, he wouldn't say. But he cried. I'd never seen him cry before. He said I thought it was the right thing. I thought she was dangerous. I said, dangerous how? Diane said, I don't know. He never explained. But after that he shut down whenever I brought it up. I left and drove straight to Detective Park's office. I told her everything. She said, I think your father committed your mother to a psychiatric facility and told everyone she was dead. I said, why would he do that? She said, control, shame, fear. People did things like that more often than you'd think, especially in the 90s before digital records. The DNA results came back in early May. Detective Park called me. She said, the remains in the grave don't match your DNA. They're not your mother. I said, then who is it? She said, we don't know yet. We're running the DNA through missing persons databases. I said, where's my mother? She said, we're working on that. I hired a private investigator, a woman named Terry Chen who specialized in finding people. I gave her everything: the hospital bill, the security footage, the psychiatric records. She said she'd start searching. Terry called me 3 weeks later. She said, I found her. She was living in a supervised residential facility in a small town 2 hours north. The facility specialized in long-term care for individuals with severe mental illness. She'd been there since 1997, admitted under a court-ordered psychiatric hold. Terry said, the hold was signed by your father. He had her committed as a danger to herself and others. I said, on what grounds? Terry said, the records are sealed, but the facility confirms she's still there. I drove to the facility the next day. It was a low, nondescript building surrounded by trees. I checked in at the front desk and asked to see Margaret Foster. The director, a man named Dr. Raymond Cole, met me in his office. I explained who I was. He reviewed my identification and confirmed my relationship. He said, your mother has been here for 27 years. She rarely speaks. She's suffered from severe dissociative disorder and depression. She's stable but largely nonverbal. I said, can I see her? He hesitated. Then he said, follow me. He led me down a quiet hallway to a small room. A woman sat by the window, staring outside. She was thin, gray-haired, her hands folded in her lap. I stepped into the room. I said, Mom. She turned slowly. Her eyes met mine. For a moment there was nothing. Then something flickered, recognition maybe, or just confusion. I sat down across from her. I said, it's me. It's your daughter. She looked at me for a long time. Then, very quietly, she said, I thought you forgot about me. I said, I didn't know. She said, he told me you were better off. I said, he lied. I visited her every week after that. Slowly, over months, pieces came back. She told me my father had committed her after she'd tried to leave him. She'd threatened to take me and Eric. He'd had her declared unfit, used her psychiatric history against her, and had her locked away. He'd staged her death, paid someone to falsify paperwork, held a funeral with an empty casket, and moved on. The DNA from the grave eventually matched a missing woman from a neighboring county. Someone no one had been looking for. I filed a civil suit against my father's estate for fraud and wrongful commitment. Diane settled quietly, releasing funds to cover my mother's care and compensation. My mother never fully recovered, but she's here and I visit. If you've ever discovered that the truth you were told was a lie someone needed you to believe, you're not alone.